Hi guys. So today I would like to quickly talk to you about how I structure my Go code. So when I have to develop an API in Go, I have more or less I wouldn't say very strict, but I have like a pattern that I like to follow when it comes to structuring my code. And the point why I do this, of course, is because basically, I would say four things I try to capture in the process. So I try to have separation of concerns. I like to have like a different layer taking care of a certain aspect of my code. Could be, say, authorization, could be my data layer, could be whatever the case might be. I like to have this in layers, and this also in turn means that I have to have this the logics implemented separately. And the point, of course, for me would be if anything should change in the future, I only have just one place to go and make the effects, and then I'm good. The next thing, of course, would be I like to have my code testable. So I like to have mock interfaces for unit testing of this each of these layers. Again, this makes it easy to independently helps me more or less like write unit tests to test each of the layers independently. So this goes in the direction of course writing unit tests. I also like to do this because of flexibility. So I like to replace implementations without changing all the layers. Again, having this more or less working or modifying or updating each aspect of my code in a bubble without having this, of course, affect any other aspect of my code. And lastly, but not the least, I like to do this way because of scalability reasons. So I like to have the probability or the option, more or less, to add new features by extending interfaces or adding new implementations. So this way, it helps me more or less ensure like a clean, maintainable, and scalable server-side application in Go. So normally, what I like to do is I have in here in my README this folder structure. Again, more or less, what I do is for me, this is like a suggestion, I would say. So it's for me, it's not strict, but it kind of like helps me to have a mental picture of what I should target in the end. There are sometimes, of course, when this varies slightly from one another, because again, in each application, I might need some specific features, and of course, to be able to maintain this, I might have to deviate a little bit. But the point is that this is normally the structure, but it is not always like something written in stone. So within the command folder, I always like to have this server subfolder, and within it, I have like the main file. So also, again, depending on how I want to run the code, maybe with I don't know, maybe like a makefile or simply from the terminal or maybe in Docker or wherever. Like I always mostly like to do it this way. Most times, this of course stays permanent and doesn't change much for most of the time, I would say. Okay, then on other than this command folder, I also like to have like a package folder. So within the package folder, what I try to do with is to define the different layers I have in my app. And in this little example, I am assuming I have like three layers basically. So there's an authorization layer, there's a service layer, and of course there's a repository layer. So the point is, in this case, of course, authorization is different from authentication. So authentication, I normally handle this via a middleware, and I've probably shown you this, I don't know, 1,000 times before. Again, nothing fancy. In this case, we simply looking I'm initially, of course, putting the tokens and sending it to the client as a HTTP only cookie, again for security reasons, so we don't have a cookie accessible like using JavaScript. Again, I try to access this token from the cookie this way. So again, I also have the option again to try to access this from the headers. But again, this is all about authentication. This is where I make sure you have the client has a valid token. It has nothing to do with authorization. This is purely authentication. Does this client have a valid token, period? So, but other than that, always like to have an authorization layer. And the point is, when your application grows, you will realize that you would have certain users within your app to have certain access to certain resources. And this is mostly what you would like to implement, let's say within an authorization layer. So if you want to, because normally I group my operations into reads and writes, and I can show you a simple example. Let me see. So in here, Oh no, I think I still have this somewhere here. Let me see. It should be in here. Let me see. Where do I have this? So if you look in here, where I have this interface user role model, I like to always group permissions based on like as read and writes. So everything that has to do with, say, like making a new insertion or like a number of insertions, of course I consider them as as writes, and things like an update, put, delete, I consider those of course as writes, and things like of course actual read like fetch and all that, I consider them as reads. So that's one thing I do. So now it helps me to of course to decide, I mean, if a user has the permission to insert a new item or a new resource, for example, it still makes sense that he's able to, of course, delete it or modify it. So, but whatever the case might be, this is one way I take care of this by grouping these as reads and writes, and then this is more or less also what I try to, of course, handle within my authorization layer. So what actually happens is that when the request comes in, it has to first go through the authorization layer to decide if this user has the permission to perform the action they are trying to perform, and it doesn't of course when this is not the case, then we of course terminate the request. Okay, so other than that, we have our service layer, which is like, it sounds like it's exactly what it sounds like. So this is where I define like the business logic. So this is where I do the other things I need to do after the user has passed the authorization layer. Now, when I've performed all this, all whatever it is I need to perform on the service layer, and now to actually maybe modify or read or whatever my data from my data store, now I have to make use of my repository layer. So this is actually like my data layer, and this is also where I get to more or less talk to the different databases or data stores that I'm working with. Sometimes, again, depending on how complex or how simple the application is, I might, of course, have this defined in here, like SQL, as you can see in Mongo, whatever repository. But most times, I actually define this as like a library. So this is will mostly be found within the internal package. So if you also look here, normally I would have, let's say, a folder here that says database, for example. And the point is that if I want to have the option of abstracting away the logic that talks to my database, I normally have it here. So that basically what happens here is that my repository would, of course, now call the defined logic within this database package and then be able to like talk to the database. So the point for me would be if it might happen in the future that I need to change the data store. So maybe from Microsoft SQL Server to I don't know, Postgres or whatever the case might be. I don't want to, if I have the intuition that this might change in the future, I don't like to put that logic in here. I like to again abstract it away so that if I ever need to change it, then of course this happens in here. And of course, models, this is where I try to define all my models. And again, also maybe even have some implementations for some specific models. So I can, let me see if I have some examples in here. And let me say user. Um, Yes, so for example, I have here my token, and I've defined the token bucket. This is like my implementation for like rate limiting. So for me, it makes sense to, because this logic is really specific to this model. So I simply have this implemented here for this struct. And now what I can actually do is, let's say, come in here, go to my middleware, and I have my rate limiter middleware, and I simply call that struct, and then of course call the method. So these methods will always be as part of this token bucket struct. If anything should change, I know that I will always need to instantiate this. So nothing here would need to change. The only place I would need to make modifications, of course, would be in here. So again, this would be abstracted away and be relegated just to my token buckets package. And then down here, I normally have my internal. So in here, this is where I put all the other implementations I like to have, like I already showed you. So like my middlewares, like my utility functions, logger, config. Most of these I like to have in here. And other than that, I always also like to have like a tests folder. So this is where I normally would write like integration tests. And to help me do that, again, depending on what I'm trying to achieve, I also like to, as you might have seen up here for this my layers, I always also like to have like a mock folder. So if, for example, in a scenario whereby, let's say, this repository needs to let's say actually reference a SQL, whatever implementation that happens to live, let's say, inside this database package. And what I can simply do is maybe to mock that and then focus mainly on the unit test I would like to do for this within this layer. So that way I don't have to test the whole thing. If I wanted to test the whole thing, of course, I have the option of doing that within, let's say, as part of my integration test. Okay, so that's mostly how I like to structure my code. If you also notice, would say like I also have like this API. The thing why I normally have this is I have a way of setting up my server. It's all most times quite similar, but it's quite handy for me because if you look into our main file, you would see it's actually quite slim. So I initialize my API and I simply call the API start function and pass the engine, in this case, the gene engine. So pretty straightforward. So that's also why I like to have this here handy. Again, for this struct, I like to implement it this way. I have my inits where I do all of this. I have my, in this case, my server is also not just an HTTP server, but an MQTT server. So that's also why I have this here. And then there's this, of course, is a helper function that helps me to initialize my server basically. And yeah, I have other helper functions that helps me to attach my default middlewares that I believe every API should have. So rate limiting config more or less gives me access to my environment variables, and then of course my course middleware. So again, if there are any other defaults I feel I need to have, I normally dump them here. If you also pay attention, you see that I don't have things here like Postgres or SQL or whatever in here because, again, it's not a default or shouldn't be a default middleware because there would be endpoints that would never need to access my data store. Okay, so they don't need to have access to those middlewares. Again, I need to make this as slim as possible. And then down here, I have this add routes. And what this simply does is basically just dump all these defined routes in here. So I have this method, I would say, or process where I like to group my endpoints. I don't like to have it all cluttered. So if you also look down here, you also see it's also, in my opinion, quite easy to read. So if you look in here, you would see I have like users are all grouped, then thin, then twin, then user. Maybe I think I have this duplicate or something. So if I restart the server, you can see I don't have that much endpoints. So that's also why I needed to restart this for you to see. Okay, now it started. So if you look in here, you will always see I have like user, I have thin, I have twin for now. And if I need to make any additions in the future, of course, I can easily just come in here, and for whichever one it is, for example, let's say for the user, I can simply just add that in here. And so it's, I like to have my APIs again. It might look redundant, but I really like to separate it this way because again, it helps me to have this in separate parts of the code. So again, it makes it a lot easier for me to get to them, to fix things, to also maybe even fix bugs, to know where specifically to look, because if it can also really get complex quite easily, to be honest. So within the internal folder, you've already seen like the database. Also in here, I like to have my handler. Again, this is one way where I more or less go straight to my more or less. So so like I showed you in up here, it might happen that this is sufficient for me, but when this is not, I also, like I showed you, I like to have like a separate folder for internal. Again, if there are like, let's say, really complex specific business logic, I like to again separate this into like this handler and then take care of those in here. And I also like to do things like say, okay, this is unless I have grpc that I need to, for example, serve like some business logic, for example, or http or maybe WebSocket. I like to again separate this way. And you've seen, of course, the middleware and additional whatever libraries I have. In this case, I have RBAC implemented, and now here would be my utility functions. So normally this is how I would structure my Go code. Again, like I said, for me, even these are not written in stone, to be honest, but they are more or less like a suggestion as to how I would normally go about structuring my API. If there is need for me to have some slight deviations to capture certain things I would like to capture, of course, I'm always slightly flexible, I would say, in that sense, to pay attention to those and, of course, do what I feel I need to do to make the code much more readable, much more maintainable, and, of course, easier for other people to collaborate with me. But for the barest minimum, I would say this is normally how I would like to go. So okay, guys, that would be all I wanted to show in this video. Of course, feel free to let me know if you agree or if you don't, or if you have like different ways you would do certain things. And I would really like to hear why you would do things a certain way and why, of course. So feel free to reach out to me. And of course, if you have any questions, again, go ahead, drop them. I would get back to you as quickly as possible. Anyway, guys, that's all I wanted to show in this series. Yeah, and until we see each other again, have a lovely evening, guys, and bye bye.